Operation Bagration. The Soviet offensive was almost completed. After fighting their way through the area of close to 800 kilometers, the Red Army units reached the shore of the Vistula River in Poland to retain this position in the summer of 1944. They managed to capture and hold the Puławy, Magnusiew, and Sandomir bridgeheads on the western shore of the river. The Red Army had built up there for the next advance to the Oder River during the autumn season and early winter. The Red Army Command presumed upon the fast advance to meet the mission objectives as soon as possible, to assist in breaking down the Wehrmacht's resistance. The ground attack aircraft was to be involved to provide air support for tank and infantry movement. Talget Begoldinov, Yuri Kukurakov, Pavel Ankudinov, and others in ground attack aircraft of the Liberator series. How does ground attack aircraft differ from the other aircraft? Fighters are the most maneuverable and high-speed aircraft designed to destroy the enemy's planes. Tactical bombers are designed to deal with deep targets. Long-range Air Force is aimed at destroying the production facilities, railway stations, and command centers located deep in enemy territory. When a breach has been forced in the enemy defenses, it is essential to suppress the firing positions and to compel the enemy infantry to take ground and hide, while own forces are crossing the mid-ground. Actually, the ground attack planes have to direct the attack within a restricted front sector, only 100 meters away from their own units. This mission can be performed only by ground attack aircraft having a heavy armor, powerful aircraft guns, machine guns, bombs, and rockets. As far back as 1940, the Red Army developed an aircraft application concept to turn it into a military means having no equivalent in the world. The fighter aircraft was supposed to inflict damage to the enemy's tanks and mortar columns, its air facilities, headquarters, special trains, and defensive works. However, at that time, the ground attack regiments were equipped only with the outdated aircraft consisted of versions I-15 bis and I-53, which were of little use for such demanding tasks. The project of specialized ground attack plane, called I-12, later on, was initiated by Sergei Ilyushin, a design engineer, in the late 1930s. The plane featured a combination of improved armor protection, powerful armament, and high speed. This version was designed to be the most produced ground attack plane used in World War II. The armored body was used as a frame structure of the plane, with wings and fuselage attached. It covered all critical mechanical parts including motor, cooling system, cockpit, and fuel tanks. The first plane of this type was built in March 1941. When the war began, about 20 I-12 planes had been delivered to the military districts located at the border, but none of the 60 pilots who were undergoing training for the new aircraft type had been back at his unit by June 22, 1941. When the new ground attack planes had been delivered for the first time, they were encased, and no one was allowed to approach them. I referred to the commanders, but never received neither a valid explanation nor specific instructions. Then we initiated pilots' training for the new aircraft at our own risk. The first I-12 pilots had not only to master the new aircraft operations, they also had to work out its tactical employment strategy. At first, low-level attacks were performed using all armaments aboard. These sudden attacks allowed to avoid the response of the German fighter aircraft because the I-1 planes were very hard to detect when low flying. But this technique adversely affected target acquisition and bombing accuracy. Since 1942, the ground attacks were delivered at the height of 800 to 1,200 meters, with a significant increase in aircraft combat effectiveness. There were no arrangements made initially for an air gunner in the I-12 planes to defend the plane from the rear. Therefore, the German fighter aircraft was free to deliver rear attacks to the Soviet planes. To protect the rear and defend themselves, a group of ground attack planes drew up in a circle pattern. Each cockpit crew making a circle pattern was responsible for protecting the one flying ahead. As there were neither well-practiced techniques nor proper fighter aircraft cover, during the early part of the war, one plane used to be shot down 8 to 9 times per mission, while some I-12 planes could not survive 3 to 4 missions in certain air regiments. Some progress had been made over time in improving the ground attack aircraft application techniques, their cooperation with the covering fighter aircraft, and air-ground communication. However, the aircraft loss rate was still very high. As Ivan Andreev, I-12 pilot, recollects, the regiment had suffered heavy losses on the Kursk salient. 18 crews were put down in 27 days. Each day, one of our squadron members would be found missing. We would sleep on our grass-stuffed mattresses, all in one place, but each day, one or another mate of yours would be killed. So you would lay there thinking, who's next? However, the situation changed in January 1945. The German army was in critical condition. Military actions shifted to Hungary and East Persia. The Soviet army took the Ploiești oil region in Romania, which Germany considered to be of great strategic importance. The Wehrmacht had to retreat to the Western Front as well. The Allies' bombing attacks caused a significant damage to the German industry. The German Air Force was finally deprived of its advantages. The human resources were near to exhaustion. The Soviet command planned to launch another offensive in Poland, using Sandomir, Magnusiv, and Puławy bridgeheads located on the western shore of the Vistula River. When the Vistula Order offensive was launched, the teamwork of ground attack aircraft, ground forces, and fighter planes was brought to perfection. The I-2 losses were reduced despite the high weapon density of German anti-aircraft artillery. The aircraft combat losses were down to one plane per 85 to 90 missions. The I-12 model showed a very high ability to survive. It was not surprising when these planes would come back to the airfield with huge surface holes and half-destroyed tail units, but the crew was safe. There were some cases of a plane having more than 500 holes all over its wings and body to return from a mission. After repairs were made in the Army Field Workshop, the plane would go back in service. Like any other pilots, the ground attack air crews were given an acceleration training course in wartime. After graduating from pilot school, the young officers could hardly have more than 10 to 12 hours of I-12 flying time. They were only able to take off and land the aircraft or reserve air regiment. The real training started in the combat troops at the front line. In the second half of the war, the replacement was put into action in a consistent manner. The novice pilots usually arrived at a regiment in a group of 2 to 3 persons, 6 as a maximum. Then their skills were tested by the officers in charge. Industrial production of I-12 trainers was initiated only in 1943. Before that, one of the combat planes would be reconstructed in the field aircraft workshops to be a trainer on their own responsibility. Such trainer airplanes were used by the squadron commanders or flight leaders to test the flying technique of a young pilot, including takeoff, landing, various dives and turns. To learn how to operate this aircraft was not a simple task. As Pavel Ankudinov recollects, I-12 is somehow challenging for a student pilot. It was not only students who had lost their way on takeoff, even expert pilots broke down the airplanes. After the flying technique testing had been completed, an expert pilot joined the novice for a flight to check how he could keep the formation while in flight or extreme maneuvering conditions. Young pilots practiced attacks and bomb releases at the ground range located near the airfield. Camera bombing method was often used for this purpose to save the ammunition, as Talget Begledinov, twice hero of the Soviet Union, recollects. Our regiment stood in a village on the fringe of the forest. A ground range was located nearby. There was a tank having a white cross on the deformed turret and a gun with bent barrel that both served as targets for training attacks. Photographic cameras stood for aircraft guns and machine guns. Then our leader reviewed the processed film to evaluate our flights. Upon completion of training attacks, the squadron commander determined whether a novice pilot would enter the combat crew. If the young pilot had put up a good performance, he had to take a navigation exam in order to show his knowledge of reference points within the radius of 300 kilometers from the airfield. The young pilots were explained how to cross the front line, how to behave above the target, how to conduct an evasive maneuver, and finally, they were ready for their first sortie. One of the expert pilots was assigned to guide the novice pilot. As Pavel Enkudinov recollects, "In my first mission, I was guided by my squadron commander. He told me, 'The point is not to get lost. When you see me nosing down, you should do the same. When you see my bombs released, drop yours as well.' And so I did, but it was only hard to navigate. Don't worry, it should be this way. After 5 or 6 missions, it will be easier for you. You did everything right. You didn't fall apart neither from me nor from the group." The novice pilots were able to monitor the air environment and navigate on their own in fighting conditions after 7 to 10 missions. There was a good reason for a popular belief of ground attack pilots that a pilot would survive if he completed 10 missions. Very high risk to which the I-12 pilots were exposed on their missions can be proven by the fact that a pilot who conducted 10 missions received his first combat award, Order of the Red Star. The I-12 crews would get up before daylight and have a quick face wash without shaving. They would shave only in the evenings, when no more missions were expected. Shaving was considered to bring bad luck. As Yuri Kukulikov recollects, "There was a case when Pataya Govorov was shaving his face after the curfew hour, but suddenly an alert was issued. He had no time to finish his shaving and only wiped the foam off his face with a towel. He had never returned from the mission." The pilots were famous for their superstitious beliefs. Practically all of them had their individual talismans. As Talget Begledinov recollects, "My great-grandmother had taught me how to pray to divert a lightning. For the first mission, I was given an airplane with the unlucky 13 number. What could I do? I decided that a missile could be regarded as a lightning, a tracing lightning. I silently said a prayer, and the mission went well. Since then, I had said this prayer before each mission." In the summertime, the pilots would wear soldiers' blouses decorated with orders, trousers and knee-high boots, or sometimes one-piece flight suits. In the wintertime, they would put on high fur boots, fur-lined trousers, and jackets with a parachute over them. When the pilots got dressed in the flight clothing, they would go to the mess facility to have their breakfast. If the weather was unsuitable for flying, everybody would feel relaxed and at ease. But in good weather conditions, many pilots and gunners were unable to eat anything, as Vladimir Meshter, an air gunner, recollects. "We didn't feel like eating because of continuous emotional stress. Sometimes we skipped lunch as well. If there were challenging missions, we drank our beverages and that's it." When breakfast was over, the pilots would gather at the checkpoint, which was usually located in a house or a dugout, and stay there awaiting mission assignment. It was one of the most difficult moments when a nervous feeling would come on the pilots. To use their expression, they would feel jitters. As Vasily Yemelyanenko recollects, I looked up from the map and found every one of the wingmen staring at my hand holding a cigarette. It was on purpose that I did not hide it. Leaning on the table with my elbow allowed my hand and forearm to be relaxed, preventing the cigarette from shaking in my fingers. This is my old trick. It has a calming effect on wingmen, making them think, if the leader is not nervous, everything is going to be fine. The squadron commander assigned the pilots for the mission, described the target and weather conditions, and determined taxi out, formation, and flight procedures. Fly at the altitude of 1,400 to 1,500 meters, approach the target, and attack on my command. Gunners must monitor the air situation. We are covered by 6 miners. Miner was the name given by ground attackers to the fighter planes providing their cover. The number of target runs was identified as well, but there could be some changes as appropriate. The routes were marked on a map, with the distance to target and flight duration estimated. There was nothing for them but to wait for a takeoff command. As Yuri Kukutakov recollects, everyone has to deal with this stress in his own way. One is reading a newspaper, but I can see that he's not reading it. He's just staring at it without turning the pages. The other one gets to talking or arguing. No one could feel indifferent to the upcoming mission. The German troops were justifiably hateful to the ground attack aircraft. The Germans gave the I-12 nicknames such as Schlachter, Slaughterer, Eiserner Gustav, Iron Gustav, and Schwarzertag, Black Death. At first, an I-12 pilot had 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, 2 23mm cannons, 4 or 8 unguided missiles, and up to 600 kilograms of bombs in the bomb bays. The I-12 was capable of carrying airborne spray tanks filled with phosphorus beads and kerosene acting as flame charges. In 1943, just before the Battle of Kursk, the I-12 received new anti-tank air bombs, PTAB, with a shaped charge. The bombs were packed in containers of 48 pieces. Each I-12 plane took 4 containers aboard. When released, the PTAB bomb covered the area 15 by 250 meters. Such density ensured high probability of destruction of any Wehrmacht tank located in the bombing sector. As Grigory Cherkassky, hero of the Soviet Union, recollects, PTAB, anti-tank cumulative air bomb, was the most effective anti-tank weapon of all we had. It is a dangerous thing. For example, a tank column consists of 10 tanks has been identified. The 6 ground attack airplanes run to this column along the road. The first plane unloads its 4 bomb bays in waves, then the second, the third, and fourth. After all 6 planes are done, 2 or 3 tanks are on fire. Here's a successful mission. In 1943, certain airplanes had been equipped with powerful anti-tank 37mm caliber NS cannons. However, they featured a strong recoil, which made the plane go outside of its aiming line. As a result, young pilots were unable to use such a high-power weapon effectively. Only experienced pilots could understand its true value. As Grigory Cherkassky recollects, "We used to call these 37mm cannons doo-doo. What a good, powerful gun. When it's brought into action, the plane seems to stop because of strong recoil." Early in the war, the ground attack aircraft was produced only in single-seat version without any defensive weapons. A fuel tank was installed behind the pilot's back and covered with an armored plate forming the hunch, which was the reason for the I-12 nickname Hunchback. Because of their poor maneuvering ability and exposure to rear attacks, the heavy ground attack airplanes were very vulnerable to the German fighter aircraft. Although the German fighters called the I-12 Zement bomber, concrete bomber, for its hardness, they mastered the way to bring it down. When from beneath, they aimed at the oil cooler. When on the side or from behind, they aimed at the tail unit. To frighten away the German fighters, many pilots simply fitted a wooden stick hoping that the Germans would mistake it for a machine gun and have no courage to initiate an attack. Of course, it was of little use. To provide protection from the enemy attacks, some technicians started to modify single-seat airplane into a two-seater directly in the field workshop at the front. For that end, the fuel tank was removed from its place behind the pilot's back, and a seat for a gunner was provided there. The hole resulting in the body was filled with a self-made machine gun mount called SCAS, Szpitalny Komarycki, rapid-fire machine gun for aircraft, which was the first Soviet rapid-fire machine gun. In autumn 1942, the factory-made I-12 aircraft in a two-seater version first appeared at the front with an air gunner's cockpit and a heavy-caliber machine gun. In the following years, this version had superseded single-seaters. The air gunner's cockpit was not protected by the armored body. A gunner sat on a canvas sling with his back to the rear armored partition. His back was protected by the 6mm armored plate, but there was no armor protection from top, from beneath, and on the sides. Nevertheless, the gunner's losses had never exceeded those of pilots. Gunner's input combined with the pilot maneuvers ensured improved level of protection against rear attacks delivered by the enemy fighter aircraft. As Nikolai Pergin, hero of the Soviet Union, recollects, when the aircraft had been fitted with gunners, the Germans became afraid of running from the rear. They couldn't shoot like in the shooting room anymore. The gunner had been badly needed. He could warn the pilot, but most important, he had a machine gun, and nobody wanted to be exposed to its burst. As a result of switching to the two-seater I-12 version, plus tactical techniques adopted by the ground attack units, the ground attack aircraft losses were reduced by 30 to 50%. On their way to Berlin, the 1st Belarusian Front and the 1st Ukrainian Front were confronted by German Army Group A, but the Soviet command had started to plan the offensive as early as in November 1944. In the course of this offensive, the troops were to liberate Poland and advance to the outer Berlin area. The bridgeheads occupied on the Vistula shore were planned to be used to breach the enemy defenses. 2 air armies were to provide air support to the ground troops. In the early part of January, the German command managed to find out that the main Soviet forces were brought together on the way from Warsaw to Jaslo to act on the offensive against Army Group A. Commanding Colonel General Harp requested additional forces, but the Hitler command was short of time to adequately strengthen its forces. The Red Army was pushing forward at the other fronts as well, from the Baltic to the Carpathians. Reinforcements were requested by all commanders at the Eastern Front. The Soviet tanks and infantry were ready to go forward, but the operation was put on hold. They were waiting for the weather to clear so that the Air Force could be used to its full value. On January 12th, the Vistula-Oder offensive was launched by breaking out of the Sandomir bridgehead. All aboard, it sounded on the airfields. The aviators run to their airplanes. The pilots visually check their vehicles. The mechanics hold parachutes for them. The gunner is in his place, checking the machine gun operation. The pilot signs in the logbook to acknowledge that the airplane is in good condition and gets into the cockpit. He puts his foot on the pedal, then fastens his shoulder harness and lap belts, and connects the headphones to the radio station. The pilot checks if the gun firing switches are on safe, if the bomb release buttons are locked, and if the brakes are pressurized. He activates the accumulator and determines the bomb release sequence at the control unit according to the instructions. A flare is shot up. The pilot starts the engine and reports his readiness. The airplanes are taxied out and lined up. Take off. The airplanes take off one by one, fly in a circle pattern over the airfield and get on their course, keeping an echelon formation. The covering fighter planes join the ground attackers while in flight. As Yuri Kukutikov recollects, when you're flying, you can think only about how to keep the formation. Interval is 50 meters. Flight distance is 30 meters. There can be no other thoughts, no fear. The ground attack aircraft used to fly at the altitude of 1,200 to 1,400 meters, if the weather was suitable for it. If not, the flight altitude was lower, sometimes not exceeding 100 meters, which made the pilots use the so-called hedge hopping technique. When the base point was approaching, the pilot marked the off time on the map with a pencil. It helped to improve the further navigation and estimate the time of approaching the target. Reaching the front line, the group leader got in touch with the forward air controller. His voice was well known by the pilots. It was very important because sometimes the enemy could appear on the airwaves. As Talget Begeldinov recollects, I was leading a large group. The command center gave me an attack command, but suddenly a strange voice sounded inside my helmet. Begeldinov, abort the attack. All group members must return to the airfield. I was momentarily confused, but promptly requested to repeat the order and gave the code word. According to the existing procedure, the response had to contain the code word in return. However, they repeated the order without the code word. Here, a familiar voice of our command center appeared. Don't listen to them, Begeldinov, proceed, and the familiar voice pronounced the code word. The forces of the 1st Ukrainian Front initiated the offensive, breaking out of the Sandomir bridgehead early in the morning of January 12th. 2 days later, the 1st Belarusian Front broke out of the Magnuzhev and Pulawi bridgeheads. Warsaw was liberated in 3 days. The prime objective of the operation was accomplished twice as fast as planned, and it appeared possible to further advance to Poznan and Breslau, nowadays Wrocław. The German command started to rapidly deploy the forces from the Western Front and other sectors, up to 40 divisions in total. However, it was impossible to restore the front line after the breakthrough. The Soviet offensive snowballed like an avalanche. A week later, the 62,000 German garrison was encircled in Poznan. On January 19th, Krakow was liberated. The fighting moved to the Silesian industrial region. 2 weeks after the operation had been initiated, the forces of the 1st Belarusian Front and the 1st Ukrainian Front reached the Oder River and gained the bridgeheads on its shore. When on the offensive, the ground attack aircraft was mainly aimed at destroying enemy headquarters and communication sentries, artilleries, trench mortars, and firing units located on the way of attacking Soviet troops. Having reached the target, the airplanes extended the distance of 150 meters and started to maneuver. Pavel Ankudinov recollects, "The fear comes when you are above the target and face the furious fire. All pilots felt under stress. Up there, you're eager to attack." However, the attack was to be started only upon an order from the command center. There was a battle on the ground, and the pilots could never know what is going on down there. A mistake could have resulted in a strike on the friendly forces. A severe punishment was established for those group leaders who committed friendly fire acts. But after an attack order sounded in the in-helmet headphones, the airplanes would extend the distance, making up a straight line. The lead aircraft starts a lay-down attack. Other pilots release their bombs according to the leader actions. All the firepower of the enemy is focused on the ground attack aircraft. As Yuri Kukurakov recollects, the most important thing to do before the run is to keep your position and not to miss the moment when the leader starts to attack. Unless you manage to dive in time, you are nowhere. The attack has been started. Now it's time for a pilot to work. He's looking for the target, missiles, cannons, and machine guns, while pulling the emergency bomb release lever, the so-called Sidor, up and down. It's quite a hot talk on the air. The miners provide covering. The forward air controller corrects our runs on the target, says where it hit, and warns about the coming fighter aircraft. Emergency bomb release lever called Sidor by the pilots was designed to back up the electric release, just in case. The bomb, which was not fully released, might explode while landing on the airfield. Both lay-down and dive bombing techniques were employed. The I-12 armored hood and cowl held special markings to provide for aiming. As Pavel Ankudinov recollects, "When going on a run, we spotted a reference point aside from the target. The arc-shaped lines were provided on the cowl, and when the nose was covering the target with the reference point being on the central line of the arcs, the bomb was dropped. As Vasily Yemelyanenko recollects, "We dropped our bombs by eye estimation, by a feeling, or as we called it, by a boot. The funny men even assigned a code to non-existing bomb site which was KS-42, meaning Tarpaulin Boots of 1942. The group turned back and took another run on the target. The lead aircraft switched to a nosedive to drop the rocket missile. The risk of being shot down increased to a very high degree. The German anti-aircraft gunners were adjusted to the target. Their fire became more accurate. Cannons and machine guns were employed in the third run. When the anti-aircraft fire was low, the ground attack airplanes could perform up to 7 runs. The circle formation of the ground attack airplanes facilitated the identification of small and moving targets on the battlefield. In addition, it allowed sufficient maneuver room for each crew to drop bombs and shoot the ground targets. Moreover, the aircraft flying behind protected the rear of the preceding plane to prevent the possible attack of the German fighter aircraft. Sometimes the anti-aircraft fire was so dense, the ground attack airplanes had to fully spend the ammunition load in the first run, releasing the rocket missile together with bombs and firing the cannons. As Yuri Kukutikov recollects, "The counteraction could be so strong, God forbid. Then we did only one run using all weapons at once, rockets, cannons, bombs. If the defense was low, several runs were possible." The ground attack plane was at the highest risk of running into fire from enemy fighter aircraft when breaking away. The following pilot was busy with shooting the ground target and unable to protect his mate. Additional I-12 planes were sometimes allocated to suppress the anti-aircraft fire. In this case, the losses of ground attack aircraft were reduced by half. As Grigory Cherkashin recollects, "The most dangerous weapon, especially at the end of the war, was the air defense artillery. The Germans had numerous and well-organized artillery consisting of solid equipment and radar. There were special groups in our regiment trained to suppress the anti-aircraft fire. When an anti-aircraft gun started to fire, the nearest planes rushed to hush it up." After the mission was completed, the leader flew away at a lower level, performing a snake maneuver, and gave a command to recover. The covering fighters who had seen the I-12 attack often voiced their comments. "Well done, Hunchbacks. Great job." There was no chance to relax. The German fighters could appear at any time. In the second half of the war, when the fighter cover became safe and each airplane was provided with an air gunner, the ground attack aircraft gave up the defense circle. As Vladimir Meshter recollects, "If the group is flying in the echelon formation, the outer gunners take the highest load. It is them who start to cut off the fighters because it's difficult to shoot from the lead vehicles as the friendly fire is possible. That's why if the squadron was short of gunners, they went to the last vehicle if possible. There might be that only one gunner was in the group." The pilots were met by their mechanics at the airfield. The maintenance personnel started to prepare the aircraft for the next flight at once, filling the water, oil, and fuel. The rockets and bombs were loaded. The cannons and machine guns were charged. Everything was done very quickly. The time interval between flights seldom exceeded 20 minutes. The photographic cameras installed in the I-12 were unloaded, and the film was submitted for development. These cameras were usually installed in the trail aircraft, or sometimes in the central vehicle of the group. As Yuri Kukutikov recollects, "Each member of our regiment had a camera gun. When we were firing the guns, the camera gun was operating. If a vehicle was fired or a tank was hit, it would be recorded. Actually, only targeted attacks proved by photographic documents were considered to be a mission." The food for lunch was carried directly to the airfield. However, the pilots usually had no appetite right after the mission, or sometimes hardly had they sat down to the table when an announcement was made. Pilots of the 2nd Squadron to go to their aircrafts. Squadron commander to go to the regiment commander. Immediate mission. The pilots could be engaged in up to 5 missions per day, but usually there were no more than 2 or 3. As there was a lack of reconnaissance aircraft at the front, and the I-12 featured a certain degree of versatility, they were assigned reconnaissance duties. As usual, a pair of ground attack aircraft flew on reconnaissance missions under cover within 30 to 50 kilometers from the front line. The aircrew was assigned a task to carry out photographic survey in the specific area in order to detect the location of enemies' camouflaged firing positions. Surely such tasks were dangerous, as well as any other jobs of the ground attack aircraft. All the more so, since sometimes it had to perform reconnaissance flights under no cover, as Mikhail Romanov recollects. The difficulty of these missions was that we were flying without fighter support. We were hedge hopping at 10 to 15 meters from the ground. While crossing the front line, there would be some fire, but then it was easier. The ground attack pilots preferred the so-called free hunting missions, although they were not provided with the fighter cover. Such missions usually involved 2 I-12s. The air crews selected the targets at their own discretion, with the attacks being recorded by the photographic equipment. As Ivan Andreev recollects, "I ran into a station. The Germans were loading a train. The engine was kept in steam. The troops were all over the platform. Flying by, I strafed like the devil against it. What a mess. I blew up the engine, dropped the bombs, and was gone." Such attacks raised the spirit of pilots and inflicted a serious damage to the enemy. Nevertheless, they were only regarded as a side work performed in addition to the main duties of the ground attack aircraft. The Vistula Oder offensive figures as the fastest advance in the history of the Great Patriotic War. In 20 days, the Soviet forces advanced 600 kilometers, with 20 to 40 kilometers per day. The high-rate advance of the ground troops would have been impossible without the support of ground attack aircraft. The I-12 simply crushed any points of resistance of the German forces. The fighters' mission did not always turn out in a fight, and they had freedom of maneuver. However, for ground attack aircraft, each mission was a fight. As Yuri Kukurikov recollects, for example, Pokrishkin performed more than 600 missions. He was involved in 158 air combats and brought down 59 aircrafts. I made 84 missions. However, if to express our performance in money terms, I'm every bit as good as him, I assure you. Of course, our hands were covered with blood, but it was our duty, and I think we fulfilled it at the highest level. We did our best. During the wartime, the Soviet plants had produced 36,154 I-12s. There had never been such a large-scale production of combat aircraft, neither during the war nor after it. The losses suffered by the Soviet ground attack aircraft were so high that by May 10, 1945, the Air Forces included only 3,289 aircrafts I-12 and 146 aircrafts I-110. In total, 365 ground attack aircraft regiments were constructed and delivered to the front during the wartime. When carrying out assigned missions, these regiments suffered aircraft and pilot losses that resulted in their 2 or even 3 reformation procedures, with aircraft personnel fully reconstituted. 31 of the regiments were reorganized 4 times, while 21 of them were reconstituted 5 times to recover their air personnel and equipment. The number of ground attack pilots killed in the war was as many as 7,837 persons. As Yuri Afanasyev recollects, I performed 70 missions. It's quite a lot. I dealt with a variety of targets including infantry, tanks, and airfields. We argued hard with our commanders, urging them to let us fly, but they did not. We wanted to fly. We wanted to fly. When you're not flying, you stay on the ground, losing your skills. We wanted to do our part. We did not care about awards. Although I've got 5 of them, 2 orders of the Red Banner, 2 orders of the Patriotic War, and a Red Star. The history of the Order of the Red Banner dates back to 1918. After the Civil War had been over, the USSR had been formed in 1924. the Order of the USSR Red Banner was established. This senior all-Union order was awarded to those who showed particular bravery, self-sacrificing attitude, and courage in the defense of the homeland. It recognized significant heroism in combat associated with the apparent danger of life. That is why it's sometimes called Order of the Wartime Red Banner. It is the only Soviet order which was marked on the front side when awarded again. The only person who was awarded with 8 orders of the Red Banner is Air Marshal Ivan Ivanovich Postigo, hero of the Soviet Union, a ground attack pilot. When the military units, ships, formations, and forces were decorated with the Order of the Red Banner, they were called Red Bannered. The first awarded was Marshal Vasily Blyucher. During the wartime, the Order of the Red Banner was awarded 238,000 times, including more than 3,000 orders presented to units, formations, forces, and plants. Commanders of small ground units, and far less sergeants and soldiers, were rarely decorated with this order. However, there were some unique cases. For example, Volodya Dubinin, a 13-year-old partisan boy from Kerch, was posthumously granted the Order of the Red Banner, and Igor Pakumov, a 14-year-old gunboat sailor, was awarded with 2 orders of the Red Banner. As Ivan Konovalov recollects, I was granted the first order of the Red Banner for saving the life of the squadron commander. I was flying in the rear. We managed to drop the bombs when the leader was shot down. He was moving to the side, and I followed him as prescribed to a wingman. His speed was going down. I was barraging around, protecting him. Finally, he landed the aircraft on the midground, but I saw the Germans running towards them. I passed, stripping them away. At that time, the pilot and the gunner got out of the aircraft and ran to our unit. It was the reason for my award. The second order of the Red Banner was granted to me for the combat performance. As a result of the Vistula Oder offensive, 35 enemy divisions were destroyed. More than 1,000 German soldiers were made prisoners. Large numbers of enemy forces were isolated in Poznan and Breslau. The distant approaches to Berlin had been opened, and the Soviet forces held this course. It was obvious that the Germans were unable to fight on 2 fronts, and the Allies' victory was inevitably forthcoming. As for the Soviet ground attack air force, it had proven to be a dangerous weapon, having at that time no equivalent in the world.